Hi, this English Language A-Level video is all about standardization. So this links into language change, and we're going to be looking at how and why the English language is standardized over time. Let's start off with the idea that standardization is a slow, incremental, very gradual process. It starts as early as the 15th century, and it goes on for centuries and centuries. So some students write about standardization as if, snap, bang, wallop, it suddenly happens. Wrong. It's a gradual, slow process. We know that English is a hybrid language, and its very inception, it's a mixture of Germanic dialects, Angles, Saxons, Dukes. We've got the Old Norse coming from the Vikings. We've got the Norman French bringing their language. So it's a real hybrid language with a whole load of different settlers coming at different times, bringing their distinctive language forms. And so across the country, in medieval times and before that, we've got a whole bunch of very, very different dialects, with Wessex down there and Northumbrian up there and East Midlands in the middle and Kentish down there, etc. So it's highly inconsistent, and it made it very difficult for people from different parts of the country in order to understand each other, which is going to be demonstrated by a text that we're going to be looking at in a minute. Okay, so the idea comes along that, for English to be taken seriously in this time and the early Renaissance period, like the early modern English period, then surely we've got to knock our language into shape in order for it to be taken seriously as a national language. Remember, English has always been thought in the medieval times as a kind of third-rate language. Your real languages are French. If you want to get on in life, it's French that you want to be speaking and writing. And of course, Latin. Latin is the language of the written word. Okay, so along comes the Renaissance period, the early modern English period, and suddenly people start to think, hang on, shouldn't we be investing more into developing English as a language that's worthy of a great country? So I'm going to show to you a very famous text. It's written by, or rather printed by, the first publisher in English. William Caxton came along in the late 15th century, entrepreneur. He'd been abroad. He'd seen all the great technology that was happening in Northern Europe, and he thought, I want a bit of that. I want to set up some printing presses, which is what he does. And he sets up his first printing press in 1476 on the grounds of Westminster Abbey in central London. And he, for the first time, starts printing texts in English. And this is absolutely revolutionary. Okay, it's a bit like, in the 1990s when the internet comes along. Imagine medieval times. All written texts are having to be very slowly and elaborately handwritten, often by monks in monasteries. Very, very few people were literate, so very, very few people could actually read. And can you imagine the cost of a single book that had taken 10 years for a monk to be elaborately handwriting out? Okay, so along comes the printing press, William Caxton's invention. And so he produces writing like this. Now, have a squint at that text. Can you make out any words? Have a very close look. I would pause the video there and see what you can make out. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to see some of the shorter words, the grammatical words that we have in English. We have pronouns there, so you've got the third person singular neuter pronoun it. We've got that over there, we've got an adverb not, we've got I over here, to, be. So often when you look at the smaller words, you can just about make out what they are. The longer words you might have to work a bit harder on. Obviously, they're spelt in a non-standard way because there's no such thing as a kind of standard orthography in the language. So you come to something like this. And if you've been paying attention to our previous videos, you will know that what looks like an F there is actually an S. So that word there spelled English. Okay. So it would be interesting for you to pore over that, but we won't spend too much time dwelling on that because after all in the exam, you're not going to get a text that looks like that. But what we're going to look at is a transcription of that. And I want you to basically summarise the points that William Caxton is making in this passage. So this is an introduction to a text that was produced in 1490 called Aeneidus. So you need to be summarising the points that Caxton's making. What points in particularly is he making about language? And as we go through it, what features have we got here that show that this is a very different form of English to current day standard English? So what I'll do is I'll read the whole thing aloud. I've got it here on 2 or 3 slides, and then we'll go back through it and try and pull apart what Caxton is on about. Okay, so here we go. And also my Lord the Abbot of Westminster did do show to me late certain evidences written in Old English, for to reduce it into our English now used. And certainly it was written in such a ways that it was more like to Dutch than English. I could not reduce nay bring it to be understood. And certainly our language now used varieth far from that which was used and spoken when I was born. For we Englishmen, being born under the domination of the moon, which is never steadfast, but ever wavering, waxing one season, and waneth and decreaseth another season. And that common English that is spoken in one shire veereth from another. Insomuch that in my days happened that certain merchants were in a ship in Thames for to have sailed over the sea into Zealand, and for lack of wind they tarried at Forlond, and went to land for to refresh them. And one of them, named Sheffield, a mercer, came into a house and asked for met. And specially he asked after eggs, and the good wife answered that she could speak no French. And the merchant was angry, for he also could speak no French, but would have had eggs, and she understood him not. And then at last another said that he would have an eren. And then the good wife said she understood him well. Lo, what should a man in these days now read? Eggs or eren? Certainly it is harder to place every man because of diversity and change of language. For in these days, every man that in any reputation in his country will utter his communication and matters in such a manners and terms that few men shall understood them. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. So what we're doing here is we are summarising the points that William Caxton is making. In particular, though, we're interested in what he's saying about language, of course, and at the same time, we're picking out areas which are very different from current day standard English. Let's just look at this first paragraph, and we're noticing here it's breaking one of those so-called golden rules of style, where it's starting with a connective. So we've got sentences that are beginning with conjunctions. Maybe we ought to say that, this is possibly like a blended mode text in the sense that it's written down, but it's probably designed to be read out aloud. And therefore, that's why you've got some of those conversational features, like sentences beginning with connectives, coordinating connectives. And so it says, and also my Lord Abbot of Westminster. And of course, you will have noticed the e's on the ends of words. So this is very much following the kind of Norman French kind of way of spelling certain words. And presumably at this time it would have been phonetic. So presumably it would have been a kind of schwa sound, like an unstressed vowel sound that would have gone on at the end of the words. So that unlike pronunciation in RP of Lord that we have today, it would be presumably more like Lord, like that, because the spelling here is a kind of phonetic representation of speech. So, and also my Lord Abbot of Westminster, we're noticing, of course, the lack of punctuation, so the lack of capitalisation on proper nouns like this. So this is a pre-codification text, i.e. it's written before the rules of the English have been nailed down by the lexicographer and the grammarians of the 18th century. So we've got no capital letters. And also my Lord Abbot of Westminster did do show to me late. So this Lord Abbot of Westminster showed recently to me, and notice how you got the emphatic did do, so that's the past tense. Showed me recently certain evidences. Now, evidence is an interesting word because we do have the word evidence today. It's an abstract noun, but we probably wouldn't use it in that way, and we certainly wouldn't use it with an S plural inflection on the end. We would say it's a non-count noun. So there's a good example of neosemy, where a word has changed in its meaning over time. Here it just means texts. Okay, so we've got Lord Abbot of Westminster showed me recently certain texts written in Old English for to reduce it to our English now used. Okay, so he's shown texts that are written, they're old-fashioned, that are archaic texts, and here he's meaning translating it. So he's got this job of trying to translate a bit of English that's old-fashioned. Not easy, I can tell you. Press the wrong button there. And certainly it was written in such ways that it was more like Dutch than English. Okay, so that's pretty clear. So it's more like Dutch than English. So this demonstrates, you know, the close connections, I suppose, with Northern European languages for the early forms of English. So to him, it looks more like Dutch. And I could not reduce it nor bring it to be understood. So I couldn't translate it and I couldn't make it be understood. Okay, so this shows the difficulty that Jonathan Swift was talking about in the early 18th century when he was worried about language changing and this, you know, different generations, later generations, not being able to understand texts written by previous generations. Notice again, we've got the coordinating connector at the beginning of the sentence. And certainly our language now used. Notice how we've got the interchangeability here between the U and the V. Obviously, that's a vowel sound rather than a V. So now used varies far from that which was used and spoken when I was born. Okay, so that's an interesting point that he's making, that he can perceive that language has changed massively over the short time that he has been alive. Okay, so generationally, there has been language change in his lifetime in the 15th century. Notice, by the way, the use of these marks here. And again, this shows that perhaps this is a kind of blended mode text where you've got the separation of sentences shown through these forward slashes. Okay, so language is very different from when he was born. For we Englishmen, and notice the kind of patriotic fervour of this, he uses the first person plural pronoun. He's assuming that the person reading this not only is their nationality, they're English, but of course they're men. Okay, so there's lots of kind of gendered and nationalistic assumptions that underlie the text. For we English men, being born under the domination of the moon, so remember this is written at a time when it was thought that the stars, things in the sky, you know, think Romeo and Juliet, really are dictating your future and what's going on. So he's saying, I was born under the domination of the moon. I was born at a time when the moon was bright, which is never steadfast, but ever wavering, waxing one season and waneth and decreasing another season. Okay, so what he's doing is he's giving us an image here. He's giving us a naturalistic image about the moon and says the moon is always changing. It's never steadfast. Steadfast means still, but it's always waxing and waning. And that common English that is spoken one shire varieth from another. Okay, so he's making an analogy between the naturalistic waxing and waning of the moon and the idea that English is also kind of varying as well. And it varies from one district to another, shire there, as in Yorkshire and Lancashire. Okay, so he's making a strong point there about language change in this paragraph, but also about language diversity and the problem of sort of mutually unintelligible dialects that are going on in 15th century England. So now he's going to tell us an anecdote which is going to kind of support what the point that he's making about language, insomuch that in my days happened. So it so happened that once upon a time, certain merchants, now we can, detect words that are coming into English here from French. Sometimes they've got fancy signs above individual letters, so merchants. So certain merchants were in a ship in Thames, in the Thames. And we notice here that in standard English we would put a definite article before the name of a river, the Tees, the Thames, and they don't seem to do it there, so that's elliptical. So we've got certain merchants were in a ship in the Thames for to have sailed over the sea into Zeeland. So they were waiting in a ship and they were wanting to sail across the channel to go across to Zeeland, which presumably means the Netherlands, as in New Zealand, okay, Holland. And for lack of wind, they tarried at foreland. So they couldn't go because there wasn't enough wind to carry across them. So they tarried. Tarried is a really good example of an archaism. It's one of these words that's disappeared from the language, but was very, very common. Read again your Shakespeare texts and you have characters tarrying all the time. So it's an archaism. They waited at foreland, which is the low-lying land on the coast. And they went to land for to refresh them. So they went from their ship to the land in order to get refreshments. And one of them, named Sheffield, so presumably this merchant is from the north because he's got this, he's called Sheffield. So it was a common way for people to name themselves in medieval times after their locations of where they live. So he's called Sheffield, a mercer. So this is a textile entrepreneur, so somebody who's buying and selling textiles. A mercer came into a house and asked for meat. And notice here the very non-standard spellings of certain words. So axed, okay, which sounds a little bit like multicultural London English, doesn't it? Asked for meat. And what's interesting about the word meat, we talked about this on neosomy. Here, meat is a hypernym, Hyper. It's a generic word. It's a hypernym for food. So, it could include vegetables and fruit. Okay, it hasn't got that specialized meaning at this point for animal flesh. Okay, so the merchants, they're from the north. They've come to a house. It's actually a shop, what we would call a shop, and they've asked for some food. And especially he asked after eggs. And the good wife, and notice the use of this word wife here. Here is a word that is specialized in its meaning over time. Here it just means a woman. Okay, and over time it's specialized, it's narrowed in its meaning because social assumptions mean that, if you're a middle-aged woman, then you must be married. Okay, so it's a good example of neosomy. And the good wife answered that she could speak no French. Right, so he's asked for eggs, but she says, sorry, I don't speak French. And the merchant was angry, for he also could speak no French. But he would have eggs. So you've got this funny altercation going on between the two of them, where the shopkeeper lady doesn't understand what the guy is saying because she thinks he's speaking French. And she understood him not. Notice the way that the negative sentence there is constructed. They didn't have the dummy auxiliary verb do to create negative sentences at that time. So, and she understood him not. And then at last another said that he would have eiren. So this is somebody else who's come into the shop and they've said, can I have some eiren? And then the good wife said that she understood him well. Now eiren here is a variant on eggs. Okay, so eiren is your Kentish dialect term for what we eat for breakfast, and eggs is the northern form of it. So what does Caxton say about this? Lo, what should a man in these days now write? So here he is, he's a printer, and he's thinking, well, what form of English am I going to be writing? Am I going to be writing the equivalent of eggs, the northern form, or am I going to be writing eiren, which is the Kentish form? Okay, so this is a really good demonstration about the extreme differences in dialectical English at the time. And certainly it is hard to please every man. Again, notice the gendered assumptions there, that it's about men that we're talking about here. because of diversity and change of language. And that's a brilliant little sentence to remember, because after all, you are preparing for an English language A-level paper that's called Language Diversity and Change. So you've got it summarised here in this William Caxton sentence. It's hard to please every person because of language diversity and language change. And again, the little symbol above change there kind of demonstrates this is a word that's possibly come into the language quite recently, probably from French. For in these days, every man that is in any reputation in his country will utter his communication and matters in such manners and terms that few men shall understand them. Okay, so, learned people, intelligent people who know a lot, they're going to talk, but unfortunately, not many people are going to be able to understand what they're saying. So this is a particular issue for Caxton. He's needing to shift a whole load of books, and so he needs to come up with a form of English that the majority of people in the country will understand. Okay, so let's sort of summarise all of everything that we've read so far then. So because of the diversity of English regional dialects at the time, and because language is changing, it was difficult for Caxton to choose which words, which form of language to use in his translations. He's translating from French. So here he's told us this anecdote. We've got these merchants from the north of England. They're trying to buy eggs from a woman in the south of England. The northerner uses the word eggs, derived from Old Norse. And what's interesting there is that the northern form has actually gone through to become the kind of standard English form. So the northerner uses the word eggs, which comes from Old Norse, comes from the Viking language. But the southern woman uses the word aren, which comes from Old English. Okay, and so she doesn't understand the northerner. So this humorous misunderstanding ensues. So here we've got Caxton. He's needing to write in a dialect that would be understood by as many readers as possible. So he decided to base his translations on a London dialect, i.e. that it could be understood by, and this comes a little bit later in the text, a clerk, which means a scholar, and a noble gentleman. Okay, so Caxton felt that his own Kentish dialect wasn't up to the mark. It was broad and rude, in his words. And so the London dialect was thought to be more refined, and it included words that were derived from French or Latin. Now, we're calling it London dialect there. Actually, in the textbooks, it's called the East Midlands dialect. And when we think today of the East Midlands, we think of places like Derby and Leicester and Nottinghamshire, don't we? But the East Midlands dialect basically incorporates London, the seat of power and the biggest population. You've got the centres of learning, you've got Oxford and Cambridge, and you've got a rich agricultural belt that is north of the capital. This is the East Midlands dialect. Okay, so what we've got here is the beginnings of standardization. And remember how I started off this video saying it's a long, slow, gradual process. It's not like Caxton comes along and suddenly he manages to standardize the language. It takes centuries and centuries. And there is a process for this. It's spelt out in your AQA textbook. It's on page 217. The researcher is Haugen, who back in the 1960s identified a 4-stage process to standardization. And he's not here just talking about English, he's talking about other languages as well. So you could look at French and see exactly the same sort of standardization that happens. Okay, so the first part then is selection. So this is what Caxton is doing, where he's looking around at the different dialect forms in the country, and he makes a selection. He thinks, well, the East Midlands dialect, out of all of those dialects, is going to be the one that's best to use. Notice the point again, I've said this in previous videos, but it is a dialect that is no better or no worse than any other dialects in the country, but it just happens to have status because it is spoken and written by some important people in the capital. So this one is selected as a kind of prestigious form. Then what you get is this codification period. So this is where you get a reduction of the variability of the language across the country, and you get books in which the lexis and the grammar and the spelling are kind of nailed down by the experts. We've talked in the past about, some dictionary writers and grammar book writers. We've mentioned about Dr. Johnson's Dictionary of 1755, which proved to be very influential for a long time. But this wasn't the earliest dictionary. There was, for example, the Dictionary of Sir Thomas Eliot, which was produced in the Henry VIII's reign in 1538. Okay, so in this codification time, you get dictionaries where you get lexicographers who start to spell words in standard ways, and you get the grammarians. So people that we mentioned in the previous video, we have Bishop Lowth, for example, who produces in 1762 a short introduction to English grammar, and Lindley Murray in the 1790s, who produces a book called English Grammar, which is used in the schools. Okay, so the rules of the language are established in this codification time. The third stage that Haugen is drawing attention to is the elaboration period. So this is where your selected language is developed for a variety of different purposes. Okay, so this is where, for example, you're using standard English in order to be explaining some of the latest scientific discoveries. You're using it to engage in trade. You're using it to be writing histories about your civilization, and colonization happens. So it's this form which is now becoming thought of as standard English, which is the form that is kind of taken abroad and kind of imposed upon other groups across the world. Okay, so colonization is an important element in this, and of course this is a time when there is lots of borrowing going on, and we notice this in the Renaissance period, but because there's more travel happening, and because we've got our scholars who are penning particular words, and they're taking them from ancient Latin and ancient Greek, this is the elaboration process of the language, where the lexicon is becoming richer and richer. So we have selection, codification, and elaboration. And then finally, we have what Haugen is calling implementation. This is the idea that variation is discouraged because all of your national newspapers, for example, are all written in this style, this standard English style. And therefore, if you're writing a national newspaper in Geordie dialect, then it's considered to be unusual and odd, and maybe ignorant. And here is where you can bring upon Jean Aitchison's 3 metaphors about people's ideas about other uses of language. Okay, so you get various groups and societies which encourage loyalty to the standard form. Like, for example, in a previous video, we talked about the Apostrophe Preservation Society, didn't we? And the Plain English Campaign and the Queen's English Society. And we have, grammar books that are written in standard English, and of course you are in college or school where you're encouraged that you must be writing and spelling and using grammar in this form. You must be using standard English in order for you to go out there into the big wide world and compete in the marketplace and become an effective person in public life. So this is the implementation period, this requirement in education and later on in life to use standard English forms. So they're definitely worth remembering, and it's worth putting remembering in the context of what we've said about Caxton and other earlier printers kind of starting off this process of standardization. And like I said before, you could look at French and do exactly the same thing, where Parisian English takes on this kind of mantle as being the proper and prestigious correct form of the language. Okay, thank you very much. In our next lesson, we'll do a little bit more about prescriptive and descriptive attitudes towards standard and non-standard English.